the twilight of the 18th century, Hausaland was a land of splendor and shadow, dotted with powerful city-states whose names carried weight across the savannah: Gobir, Kano, Katsina, and Zoria. Each city rose like a jewel in the Sahel, with bustling markets, proud rulers, and walls that stood as symbols of their might. Yet behind the walls, the rhythm of life was strained, for the people bore heavy burdens. The Hausa kings, the Sarakuna, sat on thrones wrapped in grandeur, but their rule was often marked by greed. Taxes weighed like chains on the poor, slave raiding tore families apart, and justice bent to the will of the powerful. Even the practice of faith was not untouched. Islam, long planted in the soil of Hausaland, was mingled with customs and traditions that blurred its essence, leaving many to wonder if the true path had been forgotten. Amid these kingdoms moved the Fulani, herders of cattle, wanderers of wide grasslands. They were a people without walls, pastoralists whose tents swayed with the wind. Though their hands tended to livestock, many of their hearts clung to the Quran. Yet, they were often treated as strangers, as if their place in the land was never fully secure. It was in Gobir, one of the strongest Hausa states, that a voice rose above the noise of oppression. Usman dan Fodio, born of Fulani blood but embraced by many, walked the earth not with a crown but with words that stirred the soul. A scholar, a teacher, a preacher, his gatherings drew crowds of both Hausa and Fulani, rich and poor alike. To some, he was a lamp in the darkness, a man who reminded them of faith's true meaning. To others, he was a threat, for his words questioned power itself. He spoke of justice where there was corruption, teaching that rulers were servants of the people, not masters of their wealth. He cried against heavy taxes that broke the backs of peasants and herders, declaring that the poor had a right to relief, not chains. He called for purity of faith, urging men and women to turn away from false practices and return to the Quran and the way of the Prophet. To traders, he preached honesty, to judges, fairness, to scholars, the duty to guide with truth, and to all, the call to seek knowledge, for ignorance was a prison darker than any dungeon. In every word he spoke, there was both warning and hope: warning for the oppressors who twisted faith for power, hope for the common people who longed for dignity and light. And so, his voice became more than a sermon, it was a movement, a tide that no throne could hold back. The voice of Usman dan Fodio rose not like thunder, but like the steady call of a shepherd guiding his flock. His message was simple, yet it struck deep: a return to pure faith, fairness among men, and mercy for the weak. He spoke against the crushing taxes that bled the poor, against rulers who placed wealth above justice, and against the twisting of Islam into a tool for power. To many, his words felt like cool water on parched lips. From the grassy camps of the Fulani herders to the crowded markets of Hausa towns, his message spread. The poor peasants, bent under the weight of endless levies, found hope in his promise of fairness. Scholars, weary of rulers who silenced truth, stood by his side. Traders and common folk, ground down by corruption, leaned on his words as a staff against despair. His following swelled like a river after the rains, Fulani and Hausa together, bound not by tribe but by the yearning for justice. At first, the rulers of Gobir looked upon him with tolerance. After all, Usman was a man of learning, respected far and wide, even by the court. His voice drew the people close, but it did not yet threaten the throne. Yet as the crowds thickened and his influence grew, shadows gathered in the palaces. For in every city where his name was spoken, the power of kings seemed less certain, their authority less divine. The breaking point came with King Yunfa, son of Gobir, who had once been Usman's own student. In the days of youth, he had sat before the preacher, listening to lessons of faith and truth. But as the crown settled on his head, he saw not a teacher, but a rival. Usman's growing influence over both Fulani and Hausa, his bold words against corruption, and the loyalty he commanded from commoners made Yunfa's throne feel unsteady. Fear gnawed at him, and jealousy hardened his heart. He turned his back on the man who once guided him, and with the weight of kingship behind him, he struck. Yunfa forbade Usman's preaching, scattered his gatherings, and unleashed persecution on his followers. The flame that had lit so many hearts was now under threat, but the attempt to quench it only made it burn brighter. By the year 1804, the fire that smoldered in silence could no longer be contained. Usman dan Fodio, driven from Gobir and pressed by Yunfa's persecution, made a decision that would alter history. He declared a holy war, a struggle not for crowns or palaces, but for justice, for faith, for the soul of the land. His call was not the cry of a conqueror, but the stand of a man who could no longer watch corruption rule unchecked. The first step was the Hijra, a migration that echoed the journey of the Prophet centuries before. Usman and his followers left Degel, the home that had sheltered their prayers, and moved to Gudu. It was more than a change of place, it was a line drawn in the sand. At Gudu, men and women gathered, their hearts bound by a single cause. There, beneath open skies, they pledged allegiance to Usman as their leader, not as a king, but as the commander of their faith and struggle. From that gathering, the movement was given form. Usman raised banners, appointing his most trusted lieutenants as flagbearers, each destined to carry the struggle in different directions. His brother Abdullahi, his son Muhammad Bello, and other faithful companions became the swords and shields of the mission. With each banner unfurled, a message rang clear. This was not chaos, but order, not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a disciplined march toward justice. The war they prepared to fight was no ordinary conquest. Usman's vision was of a land cleansed of oppression, where rulers governed by divine law, where the poor were shielded, and where faith was lived in truth. To his followers, this was more than battle, it was sacrifice, duty, and hope woven into one. And as their pledges rose like chants in the desert wind, the holy war was no longer a dream, it had begun. The first clash came swiftly, and it came with fire. Gobir, proud and defiant, marched out to crush Usman's rising movement. Yet the armies that met them on the field were not merely soldiers, they were men and women bound by conviction, fueled by the belief that they fought for something greater than themselves. Against the spears of kings, they raised the banners of faith, and in the dust of battle, they struck victories that shook the thrones of Hausaland. Word of Gobir's defeats spread like wildfire across the savannah. The Hausa elites, long accustomed to bending the people beneath their rule, were stunned. For every city-state that thought Usman's followers would scatter like herds before a storm, the opposite happened. They stood firm, and the storm turned against the rulers themselves. The war rolled outward, rippling across Hausaland. In Kebbi, in Katsina, in Kano, and Zoria, the clash of steel and the cry of war became familiar sounds. Each campaign carried not only weapons but also promises of justice where taxes had crushed the poor, of fairness where courts had bent to bribes, of dignity where people had known only scorn. And so, common folk flocked to the cause. Herders brought their cattle, peasants their strength, scholars their pens, traders their resources. The holy war was no longer just Usman's, it was the people's. By 1808, the old pride of Gobir could stand no longer. The kingdom that had once defied the preacher crumbled after repeated defeats on the battlefield, its fall ringing across the Hausa world like a drumbeat of change. With Gobir's defeat, the old order shattered, and the thrones that had towered for centuries trembled. What began as sermons had become a revolution, and from the ruins of Hausa kingship, a new dawn was rising, one that would carry the name of Sokoto across the land. With Gobir broken and the Hausa order undone, the struggle entered a new season. Usman dan Fodio, though the flame that lit the war, did not ride at the front of armies. He was no mere warlord chasing glory, he stood instead as a spiritual guide, a shepherd of vision. The sword, he entrusted to others, his brother Abdullahi, steady and wise, and his son Muhammad Bello, sharp with youthful command. They carried the banners across the battlefield, while Usman's words and prayers carried the people's hearts. As victories piled upon victories, the question arose, how would this new land be ruled? From Sokoto, the city that soon pulsed as the beating heart of the movement, Usman began to shape order out of triumph. The conquered territories were not left to chaos. Emirs were appointed, men trusted with both faith and responsibility. Each emir governed his domain under the shadow of the caliph, tasked to uphold justice, to protect the poor, and to administer laws not by whim but by the guidance of Islam. It was a system both old and new, old in its reverence for the Quran, new in its scope and reach. The Sokoto Caliphate became more than a collection of victories, it became a woven fabric, stretching over lands once divided by rival thrones. And as the years turned, the fabric spread wider still, pushing past the borders of Hausaland into the plains of present-day Niger, the valleys of Cameroon, and the fields that now belong to Burkina Faso. The Caliphate was not only an empire of land but an empire of faith and governance, stitched together by loyalty, belief, and order. From the dust of battle, a new state had risen, Sokoto, a name that would echo across the century as both sword and scripture, power and principle, bound into one. Life under the Sokoto Caliphate flowed to a new rhythm, a rhythm tuned to the laws of faith. Governance rested on the firm spine of Islamic law, Sharia, which reached into the courts, the markets, and the daily dealings of men and women. Justice was meant to be no longer the whim of a ruler, but a scale balanced by scripture, where the poor could speak and the mighty could be judged. Taxation, once a crushing burden in Hausa kingdoms, was reorganized with measure and clarity. The people gave their due, but in return they were promised order and protection. Trade, long the lifeblood of Hausaland, now pulsed with greater certainty. Caravans stretched across the Sahel, carrying salt, cloth, and grain, weaving Sokoto into the economy of the wider world. Education became a banner of its own. Scholars, scribes, and teachers found renewed honor, spreading not only in the courts of emirs but into the smallest villages. Quranic schools blossomed, and the call to learning was lifted high. Boys and girls alike were taught to read and recite, and generations were shaped by the ink of knowledge. Yet, like the world it replaced, the Caliphate was not free from shadows. Slavery endured, though it was redefined under Islamic rules that sought to temper cruelty. Captives could still be taken, but laws demanded pathways to freedom, and treatment was bound by codes of faith. It was a system that mirrored the times, neither abolishing chains nor allowing them to be without restraint. The Sokoto Caliphate stood as more than a political state, it was a community bound by belief. Its banners carried both empire and religion, sword and scripture, till they became indistinguishable. To its people, it was not just a government but a way of life, an empire that prayed, traded, studied, and ruled under the same sky of faith. The echo of Usman dan Fodio's holy war did not fade when the battles ended. It grew, rolling across the century like a drumbeat. From the ashes of fractured Hausa kingdoms, the Sokoto Caliphate rose to become the largest and most powerful state in West Africa during the 19th century. Its banners stretched across plains and valleys, its influence carried on the tongues of traders and the pens of scholars, and its name commanded respect far beyond its borders. At the heart of it all stood Usman dan Fodio, remembered not only as a warrior of faith, but as a reformer, a scholar, a man who wove politics and religion into one seamless garment. To his people, he was the guide who had shown that faith was not only to be spoken in mosques but lived in courts, in markets, in the very marrow of governance. His legacy endured in every law upheld, in every school built, and in every emir who ruled under Sokoto's light. The fire he lit sparked others. Across West Africa, reform movements rose, inspired by his vision of justice and pure belief. From the banks of the Niger to the coasts of Senegal, the ripple of his struggle awakened men who sought to cleanse their own lands, to challenge corruption, and to restore faith to its rightful place. Even as the century turned and the storm of colonialism swept across Africa, Sokoto endured. For nearly 100 years, it stood against time, until at last in 1903, the British marched with modern weapons and the Caliphate fell to empire's grip. Yet, though its walls were taken, its spirit did not die. Today, Sokoto's shadow still stretches across northern Nigeria. In its mosques and schools, in its traditions and politics, the imprint of that holy war remains. It shaped not only the history of a people but their identity, their faith, and their place in the story of the world. The Caliphate may have been conquered, but its legacy lives on as a reminder of a struggle that sought justice, unity, and the power of belief.